Well, early in the summer, Gary Goff asked me to take a couple of Sundays and teach, and then he suggested that I report from our trip that we made recently. And so that's what I plan to do. So many of you know, Tammy and I returned from about a 2-week trip on June the 16th, making a trip with Drs. Jesse and Joanna Long at LCU. Dr. Jesse Long is professor of Old Testament and archaeology. And his wife, Joanna, is professor of nursing, but also has a master's in Bible that she completed a few years ago. Very amazing teachers. In fact, we were told at one point, by the way, Dr. Jesse Long is very well esteemed in archaeology circles. He's well published. And one of the guys from LCU who was on the trip last year, he takes this trip, Dr. Long have been doing this about 15 years with big groups of people, but long before that, he had been involved in making trips back and forth to Israel with archaeology sites there. But anyway, Raymond Richardson, who helped put this trip together, mentioned that last year they were in Jericho and there was a team of Italian archaeologists right nearby, and they came up and they said, "Are you Dr. Jesse Long?" And he said, "Well, yes." And they got real excited, started taking pictures with him and getting him to sign things. And like, wow, who knew? But he's very humble, very unassuming, but what an amazing teacher and expert in the Old Testament and archaeology. So along with Tammy, who took copious notes in a journal, very detailed notes, and her sister, Misty, Eddie and Misty Boyles, were along on the trip. And so a lot of the notes that I tried to take, I would take a picture and then try to write about the picture as well as I could, but my texting skills aren't that good, and I couldn't figure out what I wrote, even in texting it, so a lot of times. But thanks to Tammy and Misty, we were able to get a lot of this. So some key principles that I became aware of as Dr. Long spoke about archaeology when it comes to the Bible is that archaeology is inexact. I mean, they can really find out a lot of things, but sometimes it brings more questions than answers in some cases. So it's not something that you can see one thing and say, "Oh, that must be this," every time. So you have to kind of look at that and take it for what it is. But sometimes the finds can be very effective in defending the Bible, in showing proof and showing evidences that the Bible is real, that the Bible is true. And you find outside sources with some things from the period. Sometimes you find those. The goal, but I think a good goal of archaeology, and I saw this written a couple of times, one by Dr. Long's article in the Transforming Word, a voluminous commentary put out about, a few years ago. And he has an article on archaeology of the Bible, and then also in Hoffmeier's text on archaeology and the Bible. And that is illumination of the text. When you believe something and you read the Bible narrative and we believe it, and then you go back to the site and see how the people were living, it provides a context for what was going on in these stories. While it might not prove to the skeptic that this actually happened and these people actually lived in this place, it does often, every time, it provides an amazing context for which we can understand what was going on at the time. And so you end up having a fuller appreciation for the story of God, for how God redeemed his people. He chose his people and worked through their lives. Sometimes you find everyday things. They would point out even toilets, of all things. Yeah, there was a toilet that was used. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But you find mundane things. These were real people that had everyday needs. People with fears, just like we have. People with stresses. People with joys that had to go through similar things that we experience, although not with the technology that we have. So some differences there as well. So we started in Egypt, and this picture is the step pyramid, the first stone structure that was built in a place called Saqqara. The step pyramid, considered the first large-scale stone construction in the history, built by then Pharaoh Djoser in 2700 BC. So that predated Joseph by about, yeah, you can do the math, 850 years, something like that. So that was there when Joseph was brought to Egypt. I don't know that, well, Joseph likely could have seen this because it's pretty close, within walking distance, within not very long walking distance from the capital of Egypt, then Memphis. That's where Joseph would have been, in Memphis. So likely he would have seen some of the pyramids there. What Egypt is known for, the pyramids of Giza. There are 3 pyramids that are considered part of the 7 wonders of the world. And the Sphinx, all built around 2500 BC. A grandfather who built the tallest pyramid that was then 480 feet tall. Erosion has brought it down to 450 feet tall. And then his son's pyramid that they built as tombs, his son's pyramid actually looks taller, but it's not. It looks taller than his father's, but because it starts at a higher elevation. So he put it on a little bit higher hill, makes it look taller, but it's really not as tall. So in that way, tried to honor his dad, but still tried to give himself some glory as well. And then the grandson is the smallest pyramid, 2500 BC. Pyramids of Giza, yeah, again, if Abraham was around 1900 BC, that puts it in context. These were really early. Each of those stones, a couple of tons each at least, that they built with these. These were built by farmers in their off time. So, Israelites, they didn't build the pyramids. You might see, I think it's from different movies and stuff, it's neat to think that Israelites, when they were in Egypt, they built, no, they didn't. The pyramids were already there when the Israelites were there. And this was a period of time where the pharaohs were building these huge pyramids, but they were having the farmers doing this during the flood season because their fields were flooded anyway. They couldn't go farm. So in their off time, about 100,000 workers would come in and build these pyramids. They would float them, got them at another site, float the stones, a couple of tons each, on a barge down the river, the Nile, pull them out and slide them up a ramp. There would be 2 people, I understand, that would pour milk and water down the ramp to make it slide easier. So give it a little bit of slicker surface and they could slide those stones. Still an awful lot of work. And it's amazing what they were able to do, the level of engineering, the level of masterful and just hard labor they were able to do. There are vaults inside each of these pyramids. As you know, if you've, seen movies or read books about them, these were the tombs that the pharaohs lived in. Didn't live, they were buried in. They didn't live in, they were buried in. The hope was they would live later, right? That was their hope. They were buried in those tombs. So gives you an idea of perspective. Those were way off in the distance. The pyramids at Saqqara, this pyramid was destroyed in about 37 BC by an earthquake, so it's kind of broken down, but you can still go inside of it. This was the first pyramid that actually had writing on the walls, inscription on the walls. And you could go in and see the inscription. Let me see if I can pull up my notes before I get off too much. King Unas, this was created about 2400 BC from the 5th dynasty. So, but the neat thing about this inscription was when you turn off the lights and put the light in a certain way, you saw this. You see in the far right corner an image of a warrior that stands out. You don't see that in the image of the left. It's the same image. It's just with the difference. So this king was thought of to be a powerful warrior. And then other tombs, you had more colorful depictions on the walls. Again, to give, the hope was, the thought was, the belief was that the Pharaoh, when they were raised, they needed guidance. They needed to know what they were doing, where they were doing it. They needed to have instruction, and they would mummify the body so that the soul would recognize their body. That was the idea, so that the body would be well kept. Okay. This image on the left was an entrance to a place in a museum in Cairo called the Valley of the Kings, and that's where these mummies were actually kept. Many of the mummies were in there. They did not allow photography in there, so I obeyed that. But we actually saw many of those mummies. There's a problem that archaeologists have with trying to give an exact date for the Exodus. And this is twofold, and I don't know that we want to take the time to do this, but there's a couple of places in Scripture, one's in 1 Kings, I think, chapter 6, where it says that the Exodus took place 480 years before the fourth reign of King Solomon. Well, because we know from other writings, from the Assyrians, from the Babylonians, that King Solomon's reign was about, his fourth year of his reign was in the late 10th century, 987 BC or so, right around in there. That was King Solomon. So you subtract 480 years, and you get the earlier date for the Exodus around 1447 BC, during the reign of Thutmose III. However, archaeology evidence is more supportive of a later date for the Exodus of 1270 BC, and that's if you interpret 480 years as being a symbolic number rather than literal, and they take away to where it actually refers to 12 generations and not to 480 years. If 12 generations, there's about 25 years per generation, you come up with a different number, and the later date for the Exodus being 1270 BC, or something like that. I may have gotten the explanation of the math wrong, but that's how they do that. During the reign of Ramses II, and for various reasons, Dr. Long, he said earlier in his career he believed in the earlier date, but as he's gotten into studying it more deeply, looking at archaeology and some of the finds there, now he leans on the latter date, which is really quite interesting. Ramses II, who, if you see Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, this is the one mention of Ramses. He's mentioned by name, and that is there was a city that there was built named Ramses in chapter 1, verse 11. So many take that to say, well, Ramses was building a city and naming it after himself. Well, there was a lot of things that were done for Ramses. He reigned for 66 years. He was well loved. He was very much beloved and esteemed throughout his time. Now, there's nothing written in Egyptian history. There's a lot written about Egyptian history, but nothing written about the Exodus, nothing written about losing all the troops in the Red Sea. Why? Because they swept it under the carpet. They only talked about the good things that happened. Glad our country doesn't do that, right? We only talk about the good things our leaders do, and we forget all the rest. Well, that's very much what they did in Egyptian history. So you don't find anything in Egyptian history that would corroborate the Exodus and all the plagues and all of that. But you do have very close Egyptian records of who the pharaohs were and when they reigned. I mean, it's pretty clear. And so we can go back and do some math and figure out who was Pharaoh when. Question?
In our previous congregation, we had done a study on this, and the teacher at the time brought up the idea that after the Israelites left, Egypt was never the same. And so they kind of looked at some time frames. I don't remember what it was, but after a certain point, you can see the change in leadership, the change in dominance.
Interesting.
And I can't remember where exactly they determined that was, but it was an interesting point.
That is an interesting point. And certainly, Egypt was very, very prosperous, and that's what I gathered from it. Now, I don't know that it was stated like this per se, but I gathered that Egypt was a prosperous nation. They were a world power. You think about how early it was in antiquity, and yet how much they were able to accomplish. It seems that they did indeed, by the time of, well, they were very active. I mean, it was the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho that killed Josiah, King Josiah, in the divided kingdom. And so they were still very active, but they were eventually defeated by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar. And so certainly their power diminished at some point. That much is very much true. Two-man chariot from about the same time period as the Exodus. No, this wasn't one that was in the Red Sea. They didn't grab it then, but presumably made before or after, a two-man chariot right there. You can see the detail if you got close to that picture. There was this is a pretty new museum in Cairo that's just phenomenal. We could have spent days in this museum instead of a couple hours, and that's what we had. So we just kind of ran through and saw some amazing things and looked at all the things there. Now, I did not get pictures of these mummies. This might be kind of gross to you, but I found these on the internet. Thank you, internet. And that's how I remember seeing them. I mean, I can verify that the top mummy, it was Ramses II. That's the way he looks right now. There are lots of statues of him. He reigned for 66 years. He was known as the great builder, did a number of things. Some people believe it's Amenhotep II, one of the earlier dates, and others believe it was Thutmose III. So there's both of their mummies. The things they have in common, they're mummified. They're dead, right? Now, there was a statue found many years ago. I don't remember what year it was, 1930s maybe or something like that, but a huge, enormous statue of Ramses II there in Memphis, found there at the Capitol. Now, if Ramses II was the Pharaoh when Moses was there and talking to Ramses II, maybe he saw them constructing this. There are statues of Ramses everywhere. And they really loved him as a pharaoh. At least he reigned for so long. And he was well beloved. So that part was interesting. One thing that we ended the day with, and these are thoughts that Dr. Long shared with us. If you consider the passage in Psalm 95, which we attribute to a call for worship. We use this quite a bit. We sing this song, "Come, let us sing with joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation." And we take that down. The sea is as he made it. His hands formed the dry land. In verse 6, "Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." And then, "For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Today, if only you would hear his voice. Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massa in the wilderness." Talking about the Israelites after they had left Egypt, and then their hearts got hard, and they were crying out, and they were complaining. They were grumbling against the Lord. He says, don't harden your hearts if you hear his voice. You remember that Pharaoh, his heart was hardened. And some interesting things that Dr. Long brought to the text. Someone who reads the Hebrew, understands it, and can translate it. He said the hardening of his heart passage, anytime we see the word hardened that's translated in our Bibles in the book of Exodus, it's very nuanced in meaning. There's 3 different words. Verses 2 and 5 of chapter 7, Yahweh tells Moses, "I will make his heart difficult." That's a better translation for the word hardened. I will make his heart difficult. Later, Pharaoh's heart was strengthened for hardened. Okay, I can see how hardened and strengthened would be, but we get a different take on that. His heart was strengthened. Then Yahweh tells Moses, Pharaoh's heart is heavy in the narrative from Exodus. His heart, very nuanced in meaning. We just get the word hardened. And so when we get a more precise meaning from those words used in Exodus, we get a better idea of that interrelationship and maybe what was going on in Pharaoh's heart as Moses was speaking to him about letting the Israelites, his people, go. 9 times Pharaoh hardens his own heart, but 9 times God hardens Pharaoh's heart. But again, so that all will know that I am Yahweh. So that all will know. That seems to be a key word, to know, in the book of Exodus. 22 times it's used to know. And all these, this didn't come from me. I was just copying notes from Dr. Long as he was mentioning this. But what a great thing to think about as we were in Egypt. As his heart was hardened. It came from him at first, then it came from the Lord. Why? So that they would know who Yahweh is, and they would be able to give him glory. There's some more statues there of Ramses. But some takeaways. Egypt was prosperous. Our prosperity is in the Lord. World power with the greatest army and weaponry. State of the art. Is this starting to sound familiar? Our power is through his might. Ephesians 6. 1 Timothy 1:7, God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. They were master engineers and builders. The pyramids were built by farmers in their off time. Our Father is the omnipotent creator. Anything we do to glorify him. The pharaohs were beloved. They were ambitious. They were industrious. We are driven by serving others. We were reminded of that Wednesday night, Jim Hatcher's class in Philippians. Don't only think about yourselves, but think about others. Consider others more highly than yourselves. There were strong religious convictions. They believed in the resurrection. They wanted the soul to recognize their bodies, and so that was the whole process of mummification. And they put all these things, they buried them with all their toys, in the pyramids. And there's the treasures of Egypt. We've seen movies about, read about, the King Tut's tomb and all those things. Strong religious convictions. We also believe in a resurrection, don't we? Through his power, we'll be raised. Romans 6, if we've been buried with him, we'll be raised with him, right? 2 Corinthians 4, for though outwardly we're wasting, inwardly we are being renewed day by day until we are raised with his glorious body. Amazing things, and we don't fully understand what we know about that. But we have a hope of resurrection. So those are my takeaways. But probably the biggest one I've already alluded to, or one of the big ones, the Egyptian kings are dead. Our king is very much alive, right? He's risen. He is risen. So those were some takeaways I had from Egypt. Boy, that was a flyby, and maybe we'll finish everything I've got here. I wanted to cover some things from the land of Israel now in the Old Testament. We made our way from Egypt to Israel and saw some amazing things in Megiddo, the Valley of Elah, in Hatzor. I used to say Hazer until I heard Dr. Long say it. Now I say Hatzor. That's the way he said it. We're going to look at these things at Lachish, Dan, Jerusalem. You've heard of Jerusalem, may have heard of Dan. And I had read these places before, but until I'd been there, these places just kind of went over my head. It's like, what is this, and what are we talking about here? Also, the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran. We did make a visit to Qumran and saw some of the things there. So talking first off about Megiddo. Nearly 30 settlements built on top of each other. References in Joshua to Revelation. So that's what a tel is. If you've heard of Tel Megiddo, sometimes you'll see it Tel Megiddo, Tel Dan, Tel Lachish. A tel is basically a mound with lots of layers underneath. It's like a layered cake. You go down to one layer, you'll see a civilization there. You go down another layer, you might go back centuries, and you'll see another civilization. You go back another. You think about 30 settlements on top of another, And so you think about, by the way, this is a famous cut here, just in that side of the hill there's many layers that archaeologists, to me it's just the side of a hill that looks like some excavation was going on, but they can pinpoint the layers and see all the different things there. There's an altar there, that round circular mound of the stones, a Canaanite high place. I believe that's what that was. 1550 BC, it was under Egyptian rule. So the Egyptians were active even in 1550 BC. But trying to think of what did we say there. So that might have been 300 years. So that would be consistent with the power of the Egyptians had. If you go with a later date for the Exodus, 1270 BC would be the later date for the Exodus. This would be pre-Exodus, so under Egyptian rule there. Defeated by Joshua, if you go with the later date of the Exodus, around 1230 BC. Solomon, established this as an Israelite center. It was a center of traffic. The king Ahaziah and Josiah both were killed here, died here at Megiddo. You can read about that there. Here's a little map. You see Megiddo there in the sort of the bottom left area. Look at Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Carmel, maybe about 10 miles away. In fact, we could see it. Mount Carmel, the site of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Do you remember that famous contest? I think in 1 Kings chapter 18. In the bottom right picture is the Mount Carmel in the distance. We kind of drove through it, around it, and there's just kind of trees over it, and there's nothing there. I wish there was an altar there we could go see. That this was the altar where it took place. Well, you couldn't see the altar where it took place, right? Because it got burned in the fire. It was completely destroyed. But it would be neat if there was something there. But you didn't get to see all that. The steps on the left were from the time of Solomon, from the period of the kings. So they've dated those steps. Yeah, that was actually there during the kings of Israel, the time of the united monarchy. And then Mount Carmel in the background. Solomon's gates are on the right with his people built those, under his leadership, built those gates. And there were 3 cisterns, three towers, 3 chambers as part of that gate. Also under Megiddo, there is a tunnel going to a well, so they could have going to a spring. This spring was outside the city gates, so what they had to do was during a siege, they had to go down in the tunnel to get their water, and the enemies wouldn't know about it. That way they could outlast the people that had brought them under siege. Jezreel Valley, right there, right behind us there as we're looking. You remember Jezreel, that's where Elijah ran to right after the contest on Mount Carmel against the prophets of Baal. He runs, and Jezreel is mentioned often in that narrative. And that's the valley right there with a big highway going right through it. I don't think the highway was there at that point. Valley of Elah. Valley of Elah. You might not, I don't even remember Valley of Elah, but this was the site where David met Goliath in the Valley of Elah. Now, there were lots of tour buses there, but they didn't have Dr. Long, and we did. And Dr. Long said, hey, stop here. And this was the Valley of Elah. It's a big wheat field. So we were walking down in this wheat field, already been harvested, hadn't been planted, so there was no problem there. This was where one side was the Israelites. So I believe this was the Philistine side, this was the Israelite side, and this is us in the babbling brook that's now all dried up. I've got 3 of the 5 stones from Valley of Elah. These actually came from the Valley of Elah. Now, David used, they're solid stones, it's all good. David used one of these stones to kill Goliath, right? And then Michael Burke on the trip, I'm playing Goliath. I always get to play Goliath. Yeah, I know the speech quite well. He threw another one of the stones, but he missed, and I'm here to talk about it. And I've got the other 3. No. Lots of stones there, so we tried to pick up as many as we could. And fortunately, he was throwing foam rubber, so even if he hit me, it didn't come close. But it was fun to act that out, and to remember what David did and what he said. He wasn't just defending the armies of Israel. He was defending the honor of God. The honor that Goliath desecrated that. He was blaspheming against Yahweh. And David, there wasn't, always before, when I learned about the story of David and Goliath, I felt like, wow, David, he really had a lot of nerve, and maybe he had to pray about it and get his courage up, and, would be nervous. I don't think there was an ounce of fear in his body at all. He knew. He knew what was going to take place. In fact, Dr. Long mentioned there's a rather famous archaeologist who's not known as an archaeologist. Anybody ever heard of Agatha Christie? wrote the mystery novels. Apparently, she had done some work in archaeology as well, was married to an archaeologist. She was watching, I believe in Egypt, watching these guys kill birds with a sling and a stone. Sling and a stone, and they were killing birds. And she wrote that she believed that it was a mismatch, that Goliath never had a chance. That there was no way Goliath could ever defeat David with a long-range weapon that David had. He was powerful, and the rocks were probably a bit bigger than this. They said golf ball to baseball size rocks that they used. And I had to carry them back on the plane, so shrink them down. But I still, it was still, nobody else would go out and fight Goliath and David. So maybe that was an overstatement, that it was a mismatch in terms of the other side, that Goliath never had a chance to bat David. We know that he never had a chance because Yahweh was on David's side because of the faith of David, and he knew that Yahweh would work on his behalf. So my perspective of that changed a bit, or maybe was just solidified a little bit stronger, that David was just, he had, at that point, he missed some things later on, but at that point, he was thinking about it right. He knew that he had to defend Yahweh's honor, and he did. He did just that, and I don't think he had any fear about it at all. He just had confidence going in. Couldn't wear Saul's armor. That didn't work for him, but just using what he knew, and that was the sling and the stone. Just one. And here are three more. We'll take a look at it. Hatzor is the largest tell in Israel from the 3rd millennium to 732 BC. There were 20 cities discovered in layers. Mentioned in Joshua chapter 11 that he destroys Hatzor. It was the most important city in Canaan. Joshua, Solomon, and Ahab destroyed, and remember what happened in about 732 BC. That was the Assyrian invasion. So when they came in and destroyed it. The king, there's a gate there that was completed by Solomon in his time. 6-chambered gates, similar to the gates that we saw there at Megiddo. So this was fascinating. There was a 4-room house there in Hatzor that was used by the Israelites for about 600 years. A quite fascinating detail here. Dr. Joanna Long spoke about this because the very setup of the house, the 4-room house structure that they used, was more egalitarian. So the women had more of an equal part of the household, access to different parts of the house than the Canaanite houses would have had. In the Canaanite houses, it was very much set up patriarchal, and the women were very much subservient, and the houses showed that. Not so much with the Israelite communities. Also, and this was one of the reasons, Tammy reminded me this morning that Dr. Long had changed his view. One of the reasons that he believes now in the later date for the Exodus, around 1270, is because it was right here in the 13th century that they've dated that the remains inside the houses and near the houses have changed. Because from the 13th century onward, there's no presence of pig bones. No pig bones. But before that, there were pig bones. Why was that? Israelites didn't eat pigs, right? They didn't eat the pigs. And so that was a pretty interesting detail. Also, one of the rooms, they often had animals. That's where they kept their animals. Okay? Well, that made sense if you know the story of Judges, which we've just studied about with Gary, with Jephthah, when he said, the first thing that comes out of my house, I will offer to the Lord. Well, sure, he thought it would be an animal, right? This is remains of a palace here in Hatzor that shows the palace that Joshua came in and burned. One thing that they also found here that's quite interesting is a statue, and I tried to find an image of this, but it's a statue where the head and the hands were completely severed. What does that remind you of? It wasn't Dagon, but yeah, that's the story that we know in the Bible of the quote god Dagon when was it the Philistines that stole the ark, and they got up and the statue had fallen over, and oh my goodness, the head and the arms were severed. This happened before, with the time of Joshua, before that time, but this is what they feel like, the way they desecrated their foreign gods, their pagan gods. Another way they did that, you would see a high place with a toilet right next to it. That's the way the people of God, Josiah, King Josiah, and some of the other reformers would go. They would take out the Asherah poles. Let's go build a latrine next to their high place. Yeah, that's what they would do. Pretty good way to do that, I would say. Pretty good way. Tel Lachish. This is fascinating stuff. Let me see if I can finish this before we go on. 20 cities discovered in layers at Lachish, mentioned in Joshua and Judges, the second most fortified city only to Jerusalem. In 701 BC, the Syrians invade Judah. They take Lachish. If you read about Hezekiah, Isaiah 36, 2 Kings 18 through 20, we see King Hezekiah, who's writing to Sennacherib at Lachish, and they're sending messages back and forth to each other. Sennacherib's telling Hezekiah, "You just give it up because we're going to take you, and you better surrender now." Hezekiah doesn't. He prays before the Lord. He repents. What happens? Sennacherib wakes up the next morning. His troops are all dead. But he did take Lachish. This is a famous relief. This is a replica of it. The actual replica, I think, is in the British Museum. But a relief that's in a museum in Jerusalem that was found in Nineveh, the Syrian capital of the conquest of Lachish. Sennacherib didn't get Jerusalem, but he was proud of that victory over Lachish. And here we see a whole story of the invasion of Lachish. You see on the left the weaponry, the ramps, and they're hurling stones and arrows and things. And then toward the end of it, you see them leading out the Israelites into exile. This happened in the 8th century BC. And so you see even children, young and old, being led out. So quite interesting. Another fascinating detail, this is one of the evidences of Scripture. A couple hundred years later, Lachish is taken by the Babylonians before they take Jerusalem. Jeremiah the prophet spoke all these words to Zedekiah, king of Judah, in Jerusalem. When the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all cities of Judah that were left, Lachish and Azekah, for these were the only fortified cities of Judah that remained, and they were about to fall. They were about to fall. Zedekiah is about to be taken in captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, on this clay tablet, I'm going to read what the writing says there. In this room, some 20 potsherds were discovered bearing inscriptions in ink in ancient Hebrew. These letters are dated to the last years before the Babylonian invasion of the land of Israel, beginning in the 6th century BC. The letters were written by Hoshea, the commander of one of the nearby fortresses, and were addressed to Yahush, the governor of Lachish. So they believe, there's a couple of theories. One of the theories is that the commander was in Lachish writing to Jerusalem, to a commander in Jerusalem, saying, here's what's going on. It's basically a report from the front that we can see the Babylonians. They are coming. We don't see smoke. That's the way they would give signals to other cities. Send a telegraph. Well, they would burn the smoke signal, and they couldn't do it. So the letter says, may God cause my Lord to hear this very day tidings of good. And now according to everything which my Lord has sent, this has your servant done. I wrote on the sheet according to everything which you sent to me. And inasmuch as my Lord sent to me concerning the matter of Beet Harapid, there is no one there. As for Semariah took him and sent him up to the city, and may my Lord be apprised that we are watching for the fire signals of Lachish, according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah. Lachish and Azekah are listed right here. And it says we cannot see Azekah. Some think that, well, Azekah already fell, or they haven't fallen. But it's a very much a detail that happens that we have it in writing here from someone else who was there at the scene detailing exactly what was going on, fills in the cracks and adds to our understanding, but also provides convincing evidence. So there we are on the mound helping to keep watch at Lachish. And I will get to tell Dan next time. I'm going to teach next week as well, and we'll go into Jerusalem. But we'll start right here at Tel Dan, and some interesting things that happened there. And I appreciate your attention. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And I'm sorry I kind of went fast, but we'll try to answer those next week. Or I'll tell you I don't know, which is probably the case. Thank you all.